Hi everyone, Reading Adam back here with another review video for you. And today's review video is going to be on Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This is a book that I only heard about a few years back. In fact, I don't even know if I'd heard of Nabokov before then, and I've been into reading for about a decade, so sometimes it takes a while before you discover new authors are willing to try different material, because not necessarily because your primary interests change, but perhaps your desire to look at what's the best written book in a different genre, one that you don't typically read, would be. So anyways, I was looking at, I was just curious, what are the top romance books out there? And Lolita was part of the list. So I thought, well, I'll give it a chance. I had no idea it was a work of literature that's considered one of the best. Why that is, I honestly, even after reading the book, I'm not sure. By the way, if you're new to my videos, I do contain spoilers. I'm not worried about giving spoilers. I assume you've already read the book as well, because I want to have a discussion with folks who have read the book, or that's at least the format that I'm taking. So this book, Lolita, it's very advanced in its language, use of language. And that's why I think maybe why it's considered one of the great works of literature, is not because of the content, which is, okay, the protagonist is a pedophile. It's not erotica, by the way. So if you're worried about reading the book because it's about a pedophile, don't worry. It's not. There's nothing absolutely sickening and disgusting. I mean, yes, it's disgusting in that the guy's a pedophile. He's after pubescent girls, who he calls nymphets, about 12 years of age and a little older. Not children. And also, the author makes this guy sound like the most reasonable pedophile ever, right? So the guy's very... he only goes after girls who are into going after older guys, that kind of thing. Book is basically about the protagonist grooming this one girl he meets into being his lover for a period of time, and then eventually that deteriorates, and eventually he murders someone. So it ends up as like a murder crime spree book, which was kind of, I thought, to be honest, I kind of didn't really care for the ending. I didn't care for, because the guy's writing to you, you understand early on that he's writing basically a memoir for his this criminal case that he's involved in, where he's the criminal, he's in prison, and he's writing. And you assume that he's writing as a prisoner because of his pedophilia. You assume he's in jail because of that, but you ultimately learn that that's not the case. And I thought that was kind of an interesting twist. I assumed that he had been in there for... I did not assume that he would commit a murder. He seemed too psychopathic, too much of like a serial killer type of mindset, where he just didn't care at all about anyone else's feelings. That was the way that I had understood this character, that he's basically a psychopath. Very calmly discusses murdering certain people. He does have a few flickers of emotional rage, but for the most part, he seems to be just behaving in certain ways in order to have a certain effect on someone else, so that they behave a certain way, right? It's like a psychopath is like, oh, I should probably act sad in this moment, so that person thinks I'm normal. Just think of like the show Dexter, if you've ever seen an episode of that, where how he thinks, like he's completely emotionless, but he thinks like, well, how would somebody respond in this way? And now, because our protagonist is like an English professor, although he doesn't profess at all during the whole book. Like, I don't know where his money comes from. I don't know. It didn't quite make sense to me where his money came from and what his employment was and how he was able to do the things, afford and do the things he was able to do. Maybe that wasn't important. Maybe Nabokov just came up with some base reason because that wasn't necessarily, he didn't want to get bogged down into day-to-day details of somebody going to work, and then like he wanted to create a certain narrative. So I understand when authors just kind of, just hand wave away the fact that somebody has plenty of money without really giving great explanation as to how that is. Because the guy's not a nobleman or anything. He's not, I mean, he's from Europe and he's in America during the duration of the book, except for the beginning part where he's in France. But I don't know, it's just, I find details like that, if they're well taken care of, I find that it makes the story more interesting and maybe it's more of a challenge. But I don't think it's always necessary. I just think it's like extra icing on the cake. So he sets up this whole situation, and again, his mastery. So the guy's an English professor. Let me get back to that real quick. The point I was going to make: he's an English professor, so his writing style is extremely nuanced. It's very detailed, but it's detailed in, quite frankly, one of the most perfect ways that I have ever read. I was continually impressed by just how well Nabokov was able to choose the right word for things. And I don't mean necessarily how he described this girl Lolita, or how he described like any kind of sexual thing in the book was implicit, meaning that it was, it was implied. You knew it happened, but he doesn't describe it to you. Like, and it's something, think of it, implicit and explicit. So think of it this way. On film, if something happens off screen, that's implicit. If something happens on screen, so if a murder happens off screen, it's implicit. If a murder happens on screen, it's explicit. So anyway, there's nothing explicit in the book about him having relations with Lolita. It's all implicit, but it's not even very, he doesn't bother describing that kind of stuff. He describes more of the romantic elements of how this guy's attracted to her. And anyway, it's very, very well done. You can tell Nabokov has a complete mastery. I would say he has complete mastery over the English language. Reading this book, I mean, I didn't care necessarily for the plot line, for the story, the material, or the characters even, but I found his dialogue to be very well done, very well written. It sounds exactly like how people would talk to each other, and nothing seems forced. There's not a lot of ex machina, ex machina is when a plot element is inserted into a story to resolve an issue, like magic or like an act of God kind of thing. So it's basically when a writer writes himself into a corner and has to use an act of God to get the story to continue, whereas in real life, most likely the story would end. So I didn't find much of that at all in the book. So I was very impressed with how polished it was. I mean, very polished. I'd be interested in seeing or learning eventually how Nabokov approached his writing. I have one of his nonfiction books, lectures on his Russian literature, and I do want to read that one sooner rather than later. It would be very interesting to see how he looks at and disassembles other novels. But basically, reading Lolita made me want to read all of his books, because his language is so advanced, and you learn from that. Like, it's not like, okay, it's flowery, but it's not overdone, which is interesting, because you can be flowery with your description, your adjectives, and your modifiers, but you don't have to be. Doesn't have to be overdone. He seems to know how to apply just enough, but you don't end up being like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. I'm shutting it off. I'm shutting down here. This is too descriptive. This is too much intellectual masturbation. I don't care anymore. Um, it's not that. Like, he knows when to kind of pull back just a little bit, and the chapters are not like too long. The paragraphs are not too long. It's just really, if you want to read a super polished book with super polished language, then you need to read Lolita. Like that's all it is. The content you might not care for, and I'll have to read another Nabokov book and see if I can recommend that instead. But so the content is not necessarily anything I or maybe you cared for, but Lolita is definitely something that shows you how somebody can write about seemingly the worst topic you would want to read about, a pedophile. But he makes it interesting, and he makes it interesting enough where you want to read the whole thing, and it's so interesting where you want to read his other stuff, which is every one of his stories are apparently very different from the other. I think this was his only romance book, but I'll have to look that up. So, I mean, those are the strengths of Lolita. Again, I didn't really care for how the book ended. The plot didn't seem to... It seemed a bit unrealistic, to be honest, that he would go crazy about, in his mind, about this other person who he thinks corrupted his Lolita, and his final act of love for her, whatever, is killing this person. And I didn't buy it. I didn't think that was necessary. In fact, I found it would have left a better note in my, it would have left a better taste in my mouth at the end if the book ended a bit more realistically, where he's never found out, right? Or maybe you find out that he's writing this book, but it's way later. He's old, and maybe he finally got found out because he slipped up eventually. But I mean, I wasn't too thrilled with the murder ending. It was definitely an interesting murder scene. The action scene for the murder came across as very well done. In my mind, like it's something I could picture in Breaking Bad or some well done movie or show where a murder is seen to be more like probably how a murder would be. I've never actually seen one, thankfully, but rather than something comical or overly romantic, overly dramatic. But it's yeah, I mean, so that scene was nice. So that was a payoff. But I didn't think that the story wrapped up in a way that I consider truly great literature. But anyway, I don't know why he wrote the book. I haven't figured that out yet. I haven't researched that yet. But it's just it's an interesting question to ask. Like, why? What was his point in writing this book? Was it a challenge? Was it something on his mind? Did he want to write a romance, but he wanted to? Was he the type of person who wanted to challenge himself with writing a successful romance about completely non-typical characters? It's interesting. And then what made the book popular? This is my kind of final point. This will be a shorter video than most. But my final point is Lolita popular, and do we therefore know about Nabokov because of the content in this book? This book is, it's well written, but lots of books are well written. Lots of books have mastered the English language, and there are probably lots of obscure authors out there who aren't even discovered yet who have excellent books. And that's another thing that interests me. Like, how many authors do we not know about who have written Lolita level stuff, but maybe their topic was not something that ever became popular? I think about this because Catch-22 was obscure until anti-war people picked it up and made it popular when the Vietnam War became very unpopular. So if we never had maybe thought, like, well, if the U.S. never went to war with Vietnam, would Catch-22 be a popular book? Would it be read in high school? I don't think so. I honestly don't think so, because Joseph Heller, he wrote other books. Catch-22 was his first book, but he wrote other books, and apparently put in the same amount of time and effort rewriting to these other books. But I can't name a single one. I don't know a single one, and it's probably going to be very hard to find any of those other books. Just kind of like how there are a lot of other books Ray Bradbury wrote, but you know, Fahrenheit 451 is his big one. And why did that become popular? Is it because of the topic? So that's what I think about Lolita is maybe its topic made it popular and made Nabokov a more known name among certain circles. Whereas if he didn't write Lolita, but he wrote everything else that he wrote, I'm sure some people would know about him. Like, he would be probably one of those more obscure masters that you learn about in a more obscure, more advanced class in literature in college or graduate school. But so I'll have to do some research on, you know, why Lolita became popular, because it's good food for thought. Like, what makes a book popular? What makes a book last? And you don't have to, the timeline, like this book takes place in the 30s and 40s, but it doesn't matter. Like, the timeline doesn't matter for the book. It's not out of place. It doesn't read as dated. I mean, he wrote it, I believe, in the 50s, but it doesn't read as dated. So that's partially what makes a classic timeless, is the timeless effect of where, you know, there are very few cultural references to that time period, and they're not anything to worry about. And there are very few things that you need to really understand ahead of time to read the book. So I would recommend the book because it's an example of very polished language. Now, obviously, given what I said at the beginning of the video, where I assume you've already read the book, maybe you haven't read the book and you've gotten a few spoilers, but I don't think those spoilers they're not going to detract from the meat of the book, which is the writing itself, the actual words used. That's the reason why you read Lolita, is seeing how he writes, not necessarily because of the plot. You could know the plot inside and out, but that might aid your ability to absorb what he's talking about. But I highly recommend reading it or recommending it to friends, not because of the content, but tell them, you know what, the content is disgusting, but there's nothing particularly explicitly disgusting in the book, and pay attention to his language and the way he writes the story and the narrative. It doesn't become tiring, even though it's very advanced. And I found that interesting, because a lot of advanced writing can become very exhausting, because you have to pay extra special attention. And so before you know it, some small obscure little factoid was mentioned that you didn't even think was important, but it becomes all important and all consuming to understanding the rest of the book. And I don't like books like that. I think that's why a lot of people stay away from classics, because they feel there's going to be a lot of stuff like that, and they're just going to be so confused. They won't know where the story is going, where it came from. Suddenly they forget who's this character, who's that character. But again, Lolita, read it. Subscribe to my channel, like this video, share this video. Until next time, this is Reading Adam. Take care.